So previously we have already found out our demand function, our cost function, and now it is our income function. So this will show me how much money I can get from the customer by selling my product. That's what the income function shows. So the formula for the income function is income minus price times the number of products sold. So I took that formula and I changed it to fit my project. So my income function for my project is it equals to x bracket minus 8x plus 470 bracket. After that, I needed to expand the form of the function that was already given, and that becomes the income equals to minus 8x squared plus 470x, and then brackets x is greater than or equal to 0, brackets y is greater than or equal to 0. After that, I had to define the domain and range again, and the domain for my project was 0 is less than x, less than 58, and the range was 0 is less than y, less than 6,903. So the last thing I needed to do for this phase was to graph the function on Desmos. Now for each phase, I had to graph it on Desmos because it gave me a visual of what it will look like, and it helped me kind of understand the concept and the numbers more, because if I didn't graph it on Desmos, I wouldn't be able to see what it looks like, and I won't be able to understand like, oh, which point or which slope or which parabola gives me this price. So it really helps to graph it on Desmos. And if we move down here, I can explain more about the graph and what it showed me. So as you can see, this is the graph that came from the function that I found out. So as you can see over here, we have my income function, and then the y-axis, as you can see, is income, and the x-axis shows our price. So as you can see, this is an upwards parabola, and from this graph I am able to tell that this point right here, which is in the middle, is the best price for me to sell my mama. And the 29.38 baht is how much I should sell each bowl of mama, and the 6,903 will be my best income cost. So if I sell it more than 29.38, you can see that my income is going to go down. And if I sell it less than 29.38, you see that I don't get any profit, and I also don't get any income. Okay, so bear with me, we're almost done. So right now we are moving on to phase 4. So phase 4 was to combine all the data that we previously found out and put them together. So this isn't the conclusion, but this is the step right before the conclusion. So first things first, I graphed everything on Desmos. Desmos is everything. It helps so much in this big project. It was such a major factor in helping me accomplish everything in this big final project that I did. So I graphed everything on Desmos, and this is what it looks like if I scroll down here. So the first column, which is shown through the red line, it shows the cost function. So my cost function was y equals to minus 120x plus 7,850. And the red line is actually right here. I don't know if you can tell, but this is the red line. And the second column, which is shown by the blue line, is the fixed cost. So my fixed cost was y equals to 800. If we go down to the third column, it is shown by a green line, and the green line shows my income function. My income function was minus 8x squared plus 470x. Then the fourth column, as you can see, is shaded purple, and I'll explain more about why it is shaded purple later in the conclusion, and also for why it is shaded orange here. Also, as you can see, we still have the parabola from our graph previously, and 29, like I said before, is the best price for me to sell my product. The y-axis shows my cost and income, and the x-axis shows my price. So now I will start talking about the conclusion. Okay, so now we have the standards. So I'll be explaining more about each standard and how I used it in my final project. So to start off, we have the first set of standards, which is seeing structure in expression. So we have ASS E1A. That means that we need to know how to interpret parts of an expression, such as the terms, factors, and coefficients. So I used this to look at the function and see which price will be the best profit that I need to sell for my business. So this was kind of just understanding and interpreting the expression. And I understood the terms that were used in the project. I understood the factors that it contained and the different coefficients such as like x and y. I also interpreted the demand function to find other functions such as my variable cost, cost function, and income cost, because I had to look at my demand function and be able to interpret the different expressions to find out the other functions and costs. After that, we have ASS E1B. So in this standard, we need to interpret complicated expressions by viewing one or more of their parts as a single entity. For example, interpret P 1 plus Rn as the product of P and a factor not depending on P. Now that sounds very complicated, but what it means is just that we need to be able to interpret a complicated expression by looking at the different parts that make up the expression and not the whole thing. So I did use this standard, and it was to explain what x and y stand for in my demand function. So x represents my price and y represents the estimated demand. So it is complicated, but by interpreting and looking at the different parts that make up the whole function, I was able to kind of break it up into what stands for what and which parts go where. Now we have ASS E3. So we have to choose and produce an equivalent form of an expression to reveal and explain properties of the quantity represented by the expression. So what that means is that we just need to choose and produce an equivalent form of the expression to reveal the different properties that is shown in that expression. So I didn't really use this standard in my project because I didn't need to change the form of my original demand function, but then I can use it in other equations, such as a question asking about how to find the reaction time for a chemical reaction. So I do know that I can use it for something else, but not in this project. Now if we move down, we have creating equations. So creating equations starts with ACED1. Just going to scroll down. Okay. So ACED1, we have to create equations and inequalities in one variable and use them to solve problems. So the equations include linear and quadratic functions and simple rational and exponential functions. So I did use this standard because I needed to create an estimated demand function. And I included the function to graph my income function, which turned out to be a quadratic function, and my cost function turned out to be a linear function. So I was able to kind of understand which function is which and use that in my final project. The first quarter, we really learned a lot about linear and quadratic functions and just equations in general. So I was able to kind of understand and interpret this and use it in my final project. Now we have ACED2. So we need to create equations in 2 or more variables to represent relationships between quantities. Then we have to be able to graph the equation on coordinate axis with labels and scales. So the graphing equation part, I definitely did that. So I needed to create more than one equation to represent the different relationships between the quantities for my cost function and my income function. So every single time I needed to be able to come up with more than one function or one equation, because all of them are separate and they're different, and they represent something different from each other. Then I was able to graph the equation and label the axes. So there was the x and y axis, and like I said before, like the y axis showed my cost and income, and my x axis showed my price. So I definitely used the standard. It was very helpful. I feel like ACED2 was something that I used a lot for my final project. Then we have ACED4. So we have to rearrange formulas to highlight a quantity of interest using the same reasoning as in solving equations. So an example would be rearrange Ohm's law V equals IR to highlight resistance R. So I didn't use this standard because I didn't need to rearrange the formulas to solve an equation. I did need to kind of rearrange the formula, but I didn't need it to solve something else. It was mostly to just graph it on Desmos, and all the formulas were different from each other. So it wasn't like trying to solve an equation like I'll change it and move the 3 to this side to figure out this equation, because it wasn't like that. Most of my project just mainly focused on graphing and just kind of switching up the formula, but just by a bit, so I didn't really use this standard that much. Now we have interpreting functions. Yay! If you scroll down here. So the first one we have is FIF4. So in this we need to, for a function that models a relationship between two quantities, interpret key features of graphs and tables in terms of the quantities, and sketch graphs showing key features given a verbal description of the relationship. So it's just kind of identifying the graph and being able to explain which each part shows and the relationship between the formula and the graph. So I definitely used this standard in my project because I had to do a ton of graphing, and I had multiple functions that modeled the different relationships between the different functions. So an example from my big project would be I needed to find my cost function and to move on to the next phase to find my income function. I had to show the key features, which was that my cost function is linear, and in my income function it increases, and when it reaches the maximum point it starts to decrease. Now the things that I am explaining now are the key features that I was able to find out from my graph. And this standard was definitely a main part in this big project just because I had a lot of graphing and I needed to be able to find the relationship between the different functions.